Good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to the 8th meeting of the Commission on Parliamentary Reform. I have apologies from Lorna Hood, Pam Duncan-Glancy, Katie Burke, Fiona MacLeod and Jeff Maudsley because of a combination of illness and a sad bereavement. Professor Paul Kearney of the University of Stirling joins us as an advisor to the committee. And our first agenda item today is a discussion on parliamentary scrutiny, engagement and identity, and I'm delighted to welcome Right Honourable Lord McFall, the Senior Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords, and Shauna Farrell, Coin Corla, Dale Erin. You're very welcome. Thank you for sparing the time to join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you and having a general discussion about the issues that we share. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, are there any opening remarks you would like to make before we move into discussion?
Firstly, on my own behalf, and I'm sure on behalf of Lord McFall, to say that we're delighted to be here. It's a great privilege to be invited to come to your Parliament to engage with you on the whole issue of parliamentary reform. Certainly for me, as the first elected Count Corla or Speaker of the 32nd Dáil, reform has been top of the agenda in the aftermath of the election of 2016. We have spoken in the Irish Dáil about reform for many decades. The political realities of the aftermath of the 2016 election meant that we could no longer continue to talk about reform. We had to begin that process in earnest. And I think that in the period since February of last year, we have made the most significant reforms in the history of our Parliament. And essentially, I suppose, and we can deal with this later, the most significant of those reforms has been to rebalance the power away from government and back to Parliament. Parliament now determines its business, its agenda, and government fits its programme of work into that parliamentary schedule. So the changes have been quite significant. We're very pleased with how the process is working currently, and we look forward to engaging with you in the course of the afternoon. Any questions or comments or further elaboration that you want, we're happy to provide to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr McCormick, can I thank you for the invitation today, and the Lord Speaker sends his best wishes for this exercise that you have. Each Parliament has its own style, and anything that I say would be hopeful to add what you have already done rather than any criticism on that. I had deep experience with Scottish civic society in the 1990s when I was on the Labour front bench, and I was involved in the Scottish Constitutional Convention, and we were convinced that the case for a new Parliament, new way of doing things, and that was overwhelming. And there was a proposal to have the Scottish Parliament as a hemicycle, not going the way of Westminster. That was for the bin. But last week I noted the presiding officer's response to a budget negotiations debate in the Chamber when he asked an MSP to cam it, when the latter observed that the SNP is now thrown in their lot with lentil-munching, sandal-wearing watermelons. So I asked myself, is this new politics, or is it the caustic old politics? Or as W.C. Fields would say, never give a sucker a chance as a result of that. So I welcome the presiding officer's desire for an MOT, given his description of Scottish politics as being tribal and divisive. And we see that all over, the tribal divisiveness, whether it's in Westminster, whether it's worldwide as a result of that. And I think one of the issues facing us is the challenges that we have, and I could go on and explain that later on. But given these challenges, I would say that we need a concept of good disagreement so that we can have a proper political discourse. There are many complex issues we have to face, but given the social media, it's expressed in 140 characters, and it seems as there's a solution to everything which is simple. It ain't that at all, and we have enormous challenges, all of us.
Thank you. Where to start at such a broad canvas? I wonder if I might ask you from your experience. One of our purposes is to clarify the identity between the Parliament and the government, and the fact that we know that it must happen in all legislatures in all countries, the confusion between the two, and people associate the government and the Parliament as overlapping. You mentioned, Carla, the separation between government and Parliament in your own case. How did you achieve it? You've introduced a number of reforms to, as you said, correct the balance, rebalance the government and the representative nature. What advice would you give us in the same task?
Well, I suppose, Chairman, first and foremost, there are two aspects to that. There's the public perception of the difference or lack of between government and Parliament. And we have a very effective communications unit working assiduously across a range of areas: media, broadcasting, web and social media, an education programme and a branding and marketing programme, trying to build a level of understanding amongst the public, first and foremost, as to what in fact the difference is between Parliament and government. Because I think were you to poll people on the street, you know, the level of awareness of the difference would not be as great as we would wish it to be. In terms of the practicalities of what we have done since the last election, well, immediately the election was over, and when the first meeting of the Dáil happened, the first thing that was done was that a Dáil Reform Committee was established. That Dáil Committee has met to date 25 times. I chair it, and it continues to meet. But it presented a detailed report in the middle of last year to the Dáil, setting out a number of significant changes. The first of which was the establishment of a Dáil Business Committee. That Dáil Committee is made up of all the groups and all the parties represented in Parliament. It has no weighting in favour of political parties on the basis of their size. Everyone, small or large, has the same level of representation. That business committee seeks to agree the business of the week and the business of the term by consensus. There is a provision within its structure whereby members can record their dissent, but to date there have been a few recordings of dissent, but consensus has for the most part been arrived at. And I think the first thing that happened immediately after that agreement was entered into and the process began to work was we went into the chamber to present our first business report. We asked a left-wing deputy who would not have been associated with government in any way and would have been a pretty trenchant critic of government to stand up and be rapporteur and announce the business for the week, because we've a different rapporteur every week. Now, the significance of somebody who was normally castigating government standing up and announcing the week's agreed business schedule was not lost, I think, on very many people. So in establishing that business committee and in the way in which we have done our work, we have taken the control of the work of Parliament away from government, vested it in Parliament itself, notwithstanding the fact that at the end of the day, governments must govern. So government will decide its own programme within its own time. But even on the government programme, there is consensus around the table as to what legislation will be taken, what debates will be had, and so on.
I would think, Mr McCormick, you should distinguish between efficiency and effectiveness. The Parliament can be very efficient in its family-friendly hours, but it's effective in its output. I think the role of the Parliament is threefold. It's accountability, it's scrutiny and it's engagement. It's accountability in that it has to hold those in power accountable, namely the government. So the Parliament has to be distinctive from the government. And in that respect, I would say the presiding officer is numero uno in the Parliament. He is number one here, it's not the government. And it's very important that the public understand that difference, because the Parliament has the role of working in behalf of the citizens of the country, and therefore the government are different in that. In terms of accountability, we've got First Minister's questions. Now, I think that is a highlight of the week, and it's very important that that's done well. Some people have suggested to me that it's maybe not as efficient as it should be. I know an extra 15 minutes has been given to First Minister's question to 45 minutes, but is that enough? I think that there's an opportunity for, say, the presiding officer to say, well, we have 45 minutes. I want to get 20 questions through here. That means that the questions you put have got to be 45 seconds to a minute. When we had Prime Minister's questions in the Commons when I was an MP, and this was many years ago, the Commons got restless after an individual spoke for about 45 seconds. So long-winded questions are out, and short answers are required from government as well. And I think the presiding officer has to say, well, look, I've got this set amount of questions, and if you don't get through it, we're going to be here till we do get through it, and then the discipline will come and we can get the set number of questions in 45 minutes. The aspect of scrutiny is very, very important, and this is where the select committees and the floor of the House comes into being here. Again, some members have said to me that for report stage it's been lucky if some members have 30 seconds to 45 seconds to scrutinise legislation. Well, frankly, that is inadequate. And by the way, legislation and scrutiny is adequate in many parliaments, including our own, on that. I have a suggestion in that when an act is passed, the explanatory note indicates how much time the Parliament has spent on scrutinising the legislation. Thereupon, I think that could help the Parliament itself, saying, are we doing enough here on that area? And in terms of the select committees, I believe you've got 129 members of the Scottish Parliament. You have 106 members left to go on the committees after the 23 people being in government. I think the question for the Parliament is, well, first of all, do we have enough members there? What about the select committees do we have? Do we have too many of them? Do we need to reorganise them? And then when they're reorganised, you say, well, how do we encourage longevity in those committees so that you can get the necessary expertise on the committee? It is of no value if there's a high turnover in committees, because that devalues the scrutiny aspect of it. And if you can get that right, the select committees can add to the reputation of the Parliament and certainly give out the message to society, the wider society, that yes, we are different and we are questioning the government on behalf of the citizens. You only need to look at what's happening in Westminster with the issue of tax and Google, Starbucks, with the BBC, with executive pay, with Rupert Murdoch coming to the committee and saying he was humbled by it. So the select committees need to have an identity of their own and, if you like, have a bigger presence.
Can I ask you on that point about the committee before we open up the discussion about, on the committees, the issue of elected conveners of committees that would be here, and that's been introduced. And do you think it's do you both think it's a necessary innovation to make the committees more effective, more independent of the government, and more effective in doing their work?
I think more important is that you have a mixture of opposition chairs in committees. That's really, really important, because I think the job of a chairman of a committee is to bind his or her committee, first of all, so that there's a solidarity to the committee and they're acting as one. Two, it is to educate the floor of the House on the particular area which they are functioning on, because in many cases the rest of the members of Parliament are too busy doing other things, and therefore they can engage. They don't engage in that. And the third aspect of a committee would be to build a bridge with the public, so that the public can see that they're doing their job and holding people accountable. And having opposition members on it is very important. And I know that I noticed that one committee here, whether it was at the Public Accounts Committee or whatever equivalent, had two versions of a report coming out, a minority and a majority. That is absolute disaster. If you cannot have unanimous reports, then you have no influence with individuals in the public. I chaired the Treasury Select Committee in the House of Commons for 10 years, and we had 100% record and unanimous reports. What did that do? It gave the message out that as a committee we were of one, and we were scrutinising government and we were acting in behalf of the wider society.
I suppose the situation in Dublin is a little bit different. Number one, the current arrangement in relation to committees is driven by the political exigencies of the situation. We have 158 members. We have a government that can at best command 57 or 58 votes. It is a confidence and supply arrangement in place with the major opposition parties. That has given rise, together with the whole process of Dáil reform, to a situation in which the sectoral committees that we've established no longer has an inbuilt government majority. The chairs of the committees have been appointed in accordance with the D'Hondt process. We're moving now to establish, and I agree with Lord McFall, that over time with our committees, you would certainly have a situation where people might want to disagree with the findings, but there was no process whereby a committee could produce two reports. There was the report, and if not everybody signed up to that, well, so be it. They could register their dissatisfaction. We're currently pioneering for us a budget scrutiny committee that will work on a year-round basis on the budgetary process, that will be supported by an independent budgetary office, which we are currently in the process of establishing. That independent budgetary office will be established on a statutory basis, and that budget office, somewhat similar to the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, will empower and support the membership, which is again cross-party, to number one, understand how the budgetary process works, and number two, to be able to input successfully into proposals in terms of ideas coming from groups in opposition and indeed government, feeding into the whole budgetary arrangement.
I notice it says in your reform statement about no longer will the budget be a government-only document.
No, and indeed, I mean, the government itself is in a situation where, even in terms of its own legislation, it has to face the prospect of that legislation being amended by opposition in committee or at report stage when it comes back before the Dáil. But no, I mean, in terms of the budgetary process itself, there is a greater degree of commitment across party towards having something of a collegiate approach to the budgetary process. Obviously, we have in the makeup of our Parliament people who have radically different views, but there is in this an attempt to first and foremost, through the establishment of the budgetary office, in a high quality independent office that can win the respect of people on all sides of the political divide, and indeed that can win the support of the public. The budgetary office is critical to the process, because what I certainly want to get to is a point where the budgetary office puts a costing on a particular initiative, puts a costing on a particular legislative proposal. I want us to be at a point where the public looking in will say, well, you know, if that's the figure that has been produced, therefore that must be the figure, that it has credibility amongst the public. And those who would have political ideas, you know, that might not sometimes be in touch with reality, will have to accept the analysis coming from the budgetary office, whether it's in respect of the budget itself or whether it's in respect of a particular initiative that they're proposing, a legislative initiative that they're proposing. And in fact, the idea would be that while people with legislative proposals cannot be obliged to take their legislative proposal to the Independent Budgetary Office. The idea would be that some group coming forward with a proposal who declined to have it assessed by the Budgetary Office would be asked by the public, well, come here now, why didn't you? Why didn't you go and have the independent evaluation placed on this? So I think having such a process in place forces a level of responsibility on people on all sides of the political divide.
Could I reinforce that, Mr McCormick? I think the issue of the integrity of the budget figures is really, really important. And I noted at the weekend that the Fraser of Allender Institute questioned the extra £220 million not included in the December's draft budget as a result of that. So that independence is really important, and to have a body out with Parliament to assess that, I think, is crucial for the public to have confidence in the figures themselves. So that analysis is really important. And I think it's maybe one area where a select committee here could get involved and bring the independent forecasters along so that they can give more exposure to issues like that. But the independence and the integrity of the figures, I think, is absolutely important. And by the way, I've fought on that issue myself in Westminster, so it's not anything new to the Scottish Parliament. And I well remember when Gordon Brown decided as Chancellor of the Exchequer to abolish the 10p tax rate. I did mention to him I didn't think this was going to work out, but he had full confidence in it. And I said to him, I think I'll see you in a year. And it worked out almost to a year when he came back to the committee and we had to examine it.
I should open up the discussion. My colleague, Joanne.
Yeah, welcome you both. Very good to see you both here. To Lord McFall first, I suppose I had thought when I was thinking on your role, because obviously you established a credibility as chair of the Select Committee, that in fact that was when you were in opposition, but in fact it was when Labour was in government, you were a committee chair. And one of the difficulties in this Parliament has been the sense of how you get a convener, even if it's their own party that's in government, to have that kind of independence. Do you think it was easier because your committee wasn't dealing with legislation? It was a select committee, so it wasn't dealing with legislation. Because in our structure, the committee will both deal with legislation and with inquiries and scrutiny. And as a consequence, it's used to dividing round bills. And therefore, perhaps it's much more difficult to bring together that what is an astonishing record of being able to get 100% reports agreed unanimously. Do you think, first of all, how do you establish your independent credentials as a convener when it's your own government? Is it more difficult? And secondly, is this question of it only being a select committee where you wouldn't be dividing on party lines around legislation, was that helpful?
I think it is difficult to establish that. But back to what I said earlier, longevity is important. When I took up the chairmanship of the Treasury Committee in 2001, first of all, I had to be endorsed by the committee, to be selected by the committee itself. But it took, I would say, maybe 18 months or 2 years to get the feeling of solidarity in the committee. And I think, if you like, a duty of a chairman is, first of all, to satisfy all the members of his committee. So the less turnover and churn that there is in committee, then the more hopeful one can be in getting unanimity eventually on that. And secondly, it is the fact that you are of a governing party. For example, a member of the Labour Party, I voted with the government on legislation in Parliament, but there was an element of it of which I was separate from the government, and the Chancellor and others did realise that, and it was very important to put that message out publicly, that there was a separation between myself, because I had to satisfy different people in my committee. I'll give you, for one example, Conservative Cabinet Minister who was in the news the last few days here, Michael Fallon. He was second to me in that committee, and MD knows Michael Fallon, knows that you've got to work a little bit to get an engagement with him on these issues, because he would say, is this a a Labour approach to it. No, no, this is a select committee approach, and we've all got to work together. So ensuring that all members of the committee are respected by the chairman, I think, is really important. And also I mentioned about the House itself. I think it's important for committees to get engaged in the debate in the House. For example, the Child Tax Credits initiative in Westminster, we took that upon ourselves to be involved in that from the very beginning and helped lead the debate on that in the floor of the House. Also on the 10 pence tax. What happened to the 10 pence tax one was it was going from bad to worse, and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury was up in the House of Commons giving her view, I think it was Yvette Cooper, and I intervened. I said, look, this ain't satisfactory. I'm going to hold an investigation onto this. Now, that was as unwelcome as a storm. However, we took the debate to the committee, and as a committee, unanimously agreed to the proposal we put to government. And without mentioning names in the committee, it was toughened up for the government, not by a Conservative, but by a fellow Labour person on that committee. So it gives the impression that we're working as one on the committee, and that aspect is really important. But I don't underestimate the difficulty that there is, but the committee system needs to change quite radically to ensure that you do get that longevity, and to ensure that you get opposition members, a mixture of opposition and government people on the committees. If you don't have that, then the partisan, the divisive element will be maintained. I hope that helps.
No, thank you very much for that, because I think one of the things this Parliament wrestles with is that because we don't have a revising chamber, the committees are more important in terms of sort of scrutinising what government is doing. So we're struggling, I think, with just getting that balance right, with recognising the divisions, but also how you build that kind of unity in a committee.
One example, in the House of Lords, Lord Butler, the former Cabinet Secretary, had a question for short debate a few weeks ago. And he'd asked a question of the government of the 2005 to 2010 Parliament. Of that Parliament, 70 bills that had been passed were either unused completely or only partly used. So the question that he was asking was, is all this necessary? And it's only cluttering issues up. And I think it's a really relevant issue for yourselves here. And I think select committees can engage in that. And whether you do it in the floor of the House, whether there's initiatives to have select committee debates in the House so that these things could be brought forward, I think is very important. But in terms of Westminster, I'll give you the idea that sometimes governments, first of all, they're averse to amendments, but they pass bills in many cases just for the sake of passing bills, and that half of them are unused, and they have unintended consequences as a result of that. And I think select committees can have a role there.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask Mr Fergal, from his role as a Speaker, one of the issues for us is balancing the authority of the presiding officer as in terms of the Parliament. To what extent do you think there should be a role, or to what extent do you have a role in assessing the quality of the responses that government gives to parliamentary questions, or the extent to which they decide in government business that they're actually addressing the questions of the day rather than something else that they'd rather talk about?
That's a really interesting one. Can I just make one comment about the question, or about the parliamentary questions or parliamentary committees first and foremost? I spent a number of years as chair of the Health and Children Committee in the Dáil, and it was at a time when government was determined that its legislation coming to committees would be pressed through. And while the committees were representative and could have a limited input, government had a majority, and government ensured that its legislation went through. And it was exceptional, I think, to see circumstances where it was amended on foot of proposals from the opposition. In our system, the leader of the political parties appoints the conveners, the chairs, albeit that it's using the D'Hondt method, and there's strict proportionality in the makeup of the committees. So we are now, because of the very diverse nature of our Parliament, we are now getting a situation where committees are, there's a greater degree of collegiality and consensus building taking place, because otherwise nothing happens, nothing moves. In terms of parliamentary questions, the reform process that we put in place since last February gives me, as Ceann Comhairle, as presiding officer, the authority to say to a minister, in terms of oral questions, that he's not addressing the question, that he's waffling, as the case may be, and that he needs to attend to the precise nature of the question. I have not had to use that power because, in fairness, we made much of it at the time when it was instituted in the earlier part of last year, and for the most part, because our question time to ministers is very time focused. The questioner introduces his question in 30 seconds, the minister has 3 minutes to respond, and you go back to the member for a minute, supplementary, back to the minister for a minute, and back to the member again. So you do tend at oral questions to get reasonably effective responses. Where we have a problem is with written parliamentary responses, and the reform package provides for written questions each day, each sitting day, and for 2 days during the summer recess. Now, I can, on foot of an appeal from members, review a ministerial response. In a limited number of instances where this has happened, I've gone back to the member and said, I think the minister has adequately answered your question. In most cases, I've referred the complaint to the minister in an unofficial capacity, and in, I think, practically all cases, that has elicited a more satisfactory response. The formal procedures in place allow for me to report to the House at the end of each year the number of ministers who have repeatedly failed to respond to parliamentary questions, and to lay a report to that effect before the House. So the prospect of that happening has deterred ministers, or maybe more importantly, their civil servants who draft the responses, from being too vague and avoiding the subject matter of the question.
This might be stating the obvious, but I wondered whether you're responsible for the accuracy of answers. We've had a debate and I'd be interested in the House of Lords' approach to this as well, where a minister has said something and opposition members got up and said, we can patently establish that that's not true, or it's inaccurate, and the presiding officer's response was to say, I'm not responsible for the content of the minister's answer. That would fall under the ministerial code. I wonder whether, A, is that the case in where you are, and B, if it is, how do you deal with that kind of question?
Okay. In the years since this process has been in place, that has not happened. I can act on foot of a complaint in respect of a written question, or my own observation in respect of an oral question. I would consider an inaccurate answer to fall within my remit, and I would take action in respect of, I would take immediate action in respect of an answer being inaccurate.
Okay, thank you.
The House of Lords is what is termed a self-governing house, so the Speaker doesn't have a role in that. But I have witnessed both a minister and I think just last week a peer standing up to acknowledge that they made a mistake with the statistics, and therefore the record is corrected as a result of that.
And do you, Mr. Faird, do you have authority to call a minister simply to make a statement? We have, I think, it looks a bit like your process. We have a corporate body. It's not the business body, whatever it's called, which when the business managers come together and they agree the programme for the week. But what the presiding officer cannot do is say, there's a big issue, I'm asking the minister to come and make a statement. It has to be agreed by the government.
There is a procedure whereby a special notice question, something that's considered to be of fundamental and urgent importance, can be brought to my attention, raised by any member, and I can decide that yes, a minister must come into the House and deal with that. The other thing is that each day for half an hour on Tuesday, half an hour on Wednesday, and for 15 minutes on Thursday. There are questions that can be taken from members on promised legislation or items included in the programme for government. And under that provision, a minister can respond, or I can call on a minister to clarify a particular question from a deputy.
Okay. The body I was trying to remember was the Bureau, which operates in Scottish Parliament, forgive me. But, okay, thank you.
Sorry, can I follow just up on something I thought you might have said? Just so I'm accurate about it, in asking a question, the asker of the question, the minister will respond. The member will then have an opportunity to follow that up. The minister will respond. I understand you say that the member then gets a second chance to come back at that point too. So that's distinct from our own process, which I think is an interesting one, where there is only the opening question and one opportunity to challenge the minister after that. But in the dial, they would have two.
Yeah, to be clear, 30-second introduction, 3-minute response from the minister, and then two supplementaries, 1 minute each, with 1 minute responses from the minister.
Well, that's very interesting, very helpful. Thank you. Lord McFall, could I ask you, in terms of your experience in the House of Commons, you came in 1987, and I think the select committees had been in operation for about 10 years at that point, after the sort of 79 election. So you had 10 years' experience of the select committee as a member of the opposition, and then 13 years when the Labour Party were in government. In the same way that we are doing an MOT here, did the processes and way in which the select committees conducted their business evolve over that period into what they are today, or is the way in which they operate largely as it was envisaged at the time in which they were established?
I think it's been incremental, but largely as they were envisaged. They were established in 1979 by Norman St John Stevens. But a chairman of a committee has got quite an opportunity to devise his or her own agenda on that. And I can only give you my own experience. When I was in the committee, in fact, when I was getting on the committee, I was told by a very, very senior government politician that the work I was going to do was going to be very important. It was going to take place upstairs in the committee, but largely speaking, that I would disappear from view as a result of that. So I had a look at the agenda and I decided I wasn't going to disappear from view. So the opportunity to devise your own agenda is really important. But to do that, you have to take the committee along with it. And I think, you know, in the last 7-10 years, the committee system has grown now, and I've mentioned other committees that have been involved in things. I mentioned the Public Accounts Committee, but I think it's because, if you like, of a reinterpretation of the remit which committees have. And I've no doubt that here, for example, there could be there could be a reinterpretation. For example, I don't want to be too bold, but if I was chair of a committee here and with the health service and the problems we have with the health service, I would be calling the chairman and chief executives of health boards here as a result of it. If I was a chair of a committee here with the Highlands and Islands Enterprise Board that's been put in question here, I would be questioning people in that particular area. And I would also recommend, as a committee chair, that all the senior public appointments in Scotland come before the Scottish Parliament so that they get endorsed or they're not appointed as a result at the end of the day. That's not to put committees into a position of yea or nay to it, but it's to put the committees into a situation where they've examined people and the merit or otherwise of an individual who has been appointed by a government to a senior position is exposed. And I think that aspect is really important. So I think the committees here could reinterpret their agenda.
Thank you. Looking again then at the point when you were the chairman of a select committee, and I'm interested, just because obviously of my own experience of the way things operate here, in terms of the membership of the committee, is there competition for all of the positions that are available on the committee, or are there people on the committee who have been told that's what they've got to do and have less interest in being there than others? or do you have a wholly engaged committee? And I understand the point you make about the chairman engaging with them. And secondly, how were you resourced as chairman of the committee, and how are other members resourced? Do they, in the sense that they are prepared for the subject matter under discussion, is that preparation their own responsibility to undertake? Does it tend to come from within the general employment base resource that they have within their own parliamentary office, so that they ensure that they have people there who can assist them in preparing for the committee? Or is there some separate way in which members of a committee are actually resourced to ensure that they are able to properly pursue the different aspects of any discussion that may be underway?
I'll tell you what dominated my thought when I was chairman of the committee is that the power accruing to the executive increases over the years. So what can I do as a select committee to try and bring some of those powers back to Parliament? And it affects all our parliaments, that issue. The Treasury Committee is a committee which was a very popular committee because in many ways it would be the most political committee in the House. So there was never any problem of individuals not wanting to go on the committee or not attending the committee, because as chairman you've got to ensure that you've got a lively agenda for the committee members as well. But I wouldn't say that was the case for all committees. Some committees they would get appointed by their whips and go on to a committee, and maybe they wouldn't have a full agenda at the time. So it doesn't apply to them all. The Treasury Committee had about 6 or 7 staff assisting it, 3 of whom were economists. So they were there to assist me, but they were also there to assist other members of the committee, because I said to the committee, look, you want to engage any of the staff, it's an open door on that. And I mentioned Michael Fallon. He was the chairman of the subcommittee which looked at scrutinising the Treasury and the tax element to it, and he had access to committee members of staff doing it. And like here, I suppose that the staff would make up the questions for the committee. It didn't necessarily need to stick to that. So half a dozen or 7 members that were supporting the committee. It was always the range of information was always sufficient for us, but you had to do a lot of your own work as well in addition to that. So I had no complaints with that. But I think the point that you made earlier about committees evolving, I think there is a case for trying to grab more power back from the executive and enhance the committee. Let me give you one example. The OBR that was set up by the Chancellor, George Osborne, at the time, and that Robert Choate was there. The OBR is put up as an independent body reporting to the Chancellor. But the OBR doesn't, it answers to Parliament, to the Treasury Committee, but it doesn't help Parliament with the integrity of the statistics. And I think there should be a body like the OBR being available to the Parliament itself, being available to members, so that the integrity of those figures can be validated even more as a result of that. So I think there are initiatives that can take place, but essentially the agenda is there to be looked at in its widest sense and to take it forward. So
just to be clear then, you had the support as chairman of the committee, half a dozen people who applied with the committee. You didn't, on a discretionary basis, employ additional individuals privately within your parliamentary office who did committee work as such?
No, absolutely. And
no.
The work of the committee was distinct from your work as a member of Parliament. So any staff I had would be for my constituency work, separate completely from the work that the Select Committee did.
Right, thank you.
And they were members of staff of the Parliament. The clerk and others were members of staff of the Parliament.
I understand that. Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Can I just clarify on the OBR point, Lord McFall? Having set up the OBR, did your committee and your committee then regard that as a good independent source of the data you needed?
It was just one of the sources, Mr McCormick. That was important. They came before us, by the way, for Robert Choate to get validated, when I mentioned about people coming. But there were only one of the sources, IFS being another source. And I appointed advisors to the committee, one of whom when I felt that Scotland was being left out many years ago, so I appointed Professor Anton Muscatelli. So he was one of the advisors to the committee. So we had them separate as well. So our own clerks, our economic advisors, and the OBR, IFS and others who were coming before the committee. And one thing we also did was say within the budget come along, or pre-budget, or any initiative of the government, we would have the civil servants along as well to examine the civil servants, not to make them accountable in the same sense as the parliamentarians, but to say, look, you guys have been asked to do the figures, you know, what are the issues here? Are there any holes in it? And I think I remember in terms of universal credit, we got them banged to right about £5 billion as a result, so we were able to corner the Chancellor on that.
Thank you. Boyd, sorry.
Got a couple of questions. One concerns evidence that we've already had about wider issues in society and how parliaments handle wider issues. And I noticed that you have ad hoc committees in the House of Lords, Lord McFall. I'd be interested to hear how that operates, how they're set up, and how it adds to the general body of knowledge that the House of Lords is able to call upon. And also to ask Sean O'Farrell if you have anything parallel in the Irish situation to these ad hoc committees. In Scotland, we have an issue which is now, for instance, about fracking, and that was suggested as one issue that could be addressed by such means of ad hoc committee.
Do you want me? Right, sorry. Fine. Thanks very much. The ad hoc committees came from a recommendation of the Liaison Committee in 2012. I chair the Liaison Committee presently as Senior Deputy Speaker, and as we speak, the Liaison Committee has asked members to put in their own suggestions for ad hoc committees. They've been doing that since 2012. The criteria we use for that are, first of all, that the ad hoc committee would make best use of the knowledge and experience of the members of the House. Secondly, it would complement the work of the Commons departmental select committees. And thirdly, it would address areas of policy that cross departmental boundaries, because the select committees in the House of Lords mirror the departments. So there's very little cross-departmental work that takes place. And the House of Lords, I think, is unique to look at that issue of departmental work on it. In session 2013 and 14, as an experiment, the committee team for one ad hoc committee split into two, and that year we had 5 ad hoc committees going rather than 4 as a result. This year we have 30 applications that have been put into us for ad hoc committees, and we had a meeting last week which I chaired, and we, on a thematic basis, reduced those 30 down to about 10 or 11. So the members of my committee will look at these 10 or 11 thematic areas more in depth. The committee clerks will discuss it with the individuals who put in the nominations from them. And then next month, when I chair the committee, I would hope that we take those 10 down to 4, one of which has to be a pre-legislative committee. And the pre-legislative committee report that was undertaken last year is coming out in the next few weeks. Now, the ad hoc committees are established for about a year, 9 months. They're a one-off. And I think they're very helpful to people, but there are advantages and there are disadvantages to them. For example, some of the subject areas are very broad. We had one going this year, which was ready for ageing and the long-term sustainability of the NHS, chaired by Lord Patel, who is the Chancellor of Dundee University. And I've had a chat with Lord Patel, and there's a lot of great work that's going on in that. But as you can imagine, the remit is very, very huge. Can you get anything done in 9 months? The second disadvantage with it is that there's largely no follow-up as a result from that, and it's one of the things I want to look at with members, because what I felt when we'd select committees is that you should never take a report off the table. It should always be there to be resurrected, because if you have a one-off inquiry and people know it's off the table, then the initiative is lost as a result of that. So I would like to look at that issue with the future. And we can be, if you like, innovative in terms of ad hoc committees, because during the second reading of the Trade Union Bill in January of this year, there was quite a lot of concern expressed from across the House about the potential impact of clauses 10 and 11 of the bill. As a result of that, the House agreed to set up a select committee, and I would quote, to consider the impact of clauses 10 and 11 of the Trade Union Bill in relation to the Committee on Standards and Public Life report, political party financing and ending the big donor culture. The Parliament, given that we've got constraints and staff members and whatever else, we decided they could have that ad hoc committee, but it would be on a very truncated basis, and it could work for just a month as a result of that. So we had an all-party engagement on the committee with that, and the committee itself concluded that the Trade Union Bill would have a significant impact on union political funds and in turn on Labour Party funding. But the committee offered a way forward to mitigate that. And therefore, on 26th of April, the Government accepted all the committee's recommendations in the bill and tabled amendments in the Commons accordingly. So an example of, if you like, quick thinking, an ad hoc committee and a really quick ad hoc committee did some business there. So building flexibility into your Parliament, I think, is extremely important. I think that was a good example of an ad hoc committee. And ad hoc committees actually have been proved to be very, very popular. As I mentioned, I've had 30 submissions, and I've had different members coming along to me to explain their submission, which I then asked them to put into writing. But given that we're still in the business of doing that, I don't think I could share the areas for you, but you would need to guess a lot to find out what they are.
Very briefly then, in relation to the situation in Dublin, we have about 20 sectoral and standing committees. They are very well resourced. Each of them have their own dedicated team, plus they have access to a research team within the Houses of the Oireachtas of about 40 personnel. In addition to that, individual members who may get a committee approval to undertake a particular piece of research can attract a particular stipend to help them produce that piece of work. Just in relation to state boards that was referred to earlier, the chair designate of each state board is required to come before the appropriate committee and give evidence about his or her proposals for that particular board. In terms of ad hoc committees, we don't seem to have the same tradition of the establishment of significant numbers of ad hoc committees as they have done in Westminster. I can think in my time of a constitutional reform committee. I served on a children's welfare committee, and in the course of this, the 32nd Dáil, we have two ad hoc committees, both of them addressing areas of crisis in public policy. One would be in the housing area. It met very shortly after it was established. It was a cross-party committee, established very shortly after the Dáil resumed. It was challenged with coming up with a series of proposals to address the housing crisis. It did so. It was adequately resourced to do that job of work. And we have currently an all-party committee on the health service meeting to try and devise a 20-year strategy for the health service. We have had, as you're probably aware, major problems in the Republic in terms of our health service. This group is being supported and resourced with the internal facilities of the House. But last week, for example, on foot of a request, we approved, I think, €130,000 to them to seek additional expert support from Trinity College. So we don't have them very frequently. We support them when we do, and where they need additional external resources, we make those resources available to them.
I was just going to follow up with a second question about the use of external expertise in your own situation in the Dáil. And one of the issues facing us in Scotland is capacity in the Parliament, as the Parliament has taken on more powers and the opportunity for members of Parliament to engage in more scrutiny becomes more demanding on time. There's also the question of expertise, how much expertise is resident in the Parliament as it is constituted, and the ability to scrutinise legislation in depth. Have you in Ireland made use of external experts, lay members in that exercise?
Yes, I mean the sectoral committees would routinely reach out not just to interest groups but to experts in the community, in the country, to advise them in terms of legislative proposals. For example, a key element of the reform that is currently in place is that all legislative proposals coming before the Houses, except in circumstances where the sponsoring committee deem it unnecessary, all legislation will be subject to pre-legislative scrutiny. And that would involve engagement with interest groups, lobby groups, and with experts in the particular field. We engage on an ongoing basis with the Economic and Social Research Institute. In terms of the resources that we have internally, I think we accept that we don't have adequate, even though we have significant resources, we don't have adequate resources. And two of the areas of development was the Independent Budgetary Office, which I mentioned to you earlier, which we're in the course of developing. And the second one would be in the Parliamentary Legal Advisor's Office, which has been the subject of a significant external review and which will now be expanded quite significantly in order to be able to provide the level of expert advice that parliamentarians need, and specifically to be able to support opposition and indeed government backbench deputies in developing and coming forward with legislative initiatives.
Thank you.
John?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. Thanks for coming along and for your information. It's very helpful. I have some questions for Mr O'Farrell, if I may, please, and relate to the impetus for reform. I note that your subcommittee said, and the note I have here, quote, that the negotiations to form the next government should not begin for at least another month, and this was to allow parties in Parliament to work together on parliamentary reform. Has reform been exclusively been driven by the arithmetic of the Dáil, Mr O'Farrell?
I think that's a very fair question. I think the enthusiasm and initiative, the enthusiasm for the initiative has been driven by the political circumstances. But I think as well that there has been a growing realisation, particularly during the years of recession, that we had to be more open, that our approach to democracy had to be more inclusive, that among the mistakes that we made was to dispatch contrarians and not to listen carefully enough. So I think that while certainly the arithmetic has lended to the urgency of the process, nonetheless there has been a maturing of the political system to a point that we realise that we need to do things maybe a little bit similarly to how it's done in many, many other European democracies.
Thanks. And can I ask too about the representation you say exists across the parties on your committee there? Yet you made a number of references to the Hunt system. When does that kick in and when does it not kick in?
Well, okay, it kicks in terms of the appointment of chairs. So how many chairs are available to each group is determined by the Hunt. The makeup of the committees is decided on the basis of proportionality. There's a similarity, obviously, between the two. But the Hunt for the appointment of the chairs, and because it has been applied in the north and because it's used, I think, as well in the north-south bodies, it's been an acceptable criteria to use.
And somewhere again in these notes I read about a 6-month or 12-month review. Have these been undertaken? And
oh, they have. in fact, the process, details of the process have been under continuous review, because when you make the sort of changes that we've made, which are, you know, quite radical for some people, you're doing it in good faith. You've sat around a table, you've deliberated, you think that this is the correct way to go, but you've got to accept that you don't always get it right, and there may be elements of this that need to be tweaked, and we have tweaked some of the elements of the reform package, but the substantive issues have not changed, and the substantive elements of the reform package are as strongly supported today as they were initially. Interestingly, we had a business committee meeting on Thursday, and at the end of it, one of the changes we made was to consolidate voting into a Thursday afternoon. So we have a voting block on a Thursday, except the only exceptions to that are where a member is to be suspended, and thankfully we haven't had to suspend anyone, and the other is where report and final stages of a piece of legislation has been taken. So the bulk of your votes are now happening on a Thursday afternoon, whereas previously you could have votes every day, and a number of them. But a number of the left-wing deputies were pointing out on Thursday that there wasn't the same atmosphere in the House on a Tuesday or Wednesday because there was no certainty of a vote taking place. So there is in reality, in the aftermath of the changes, a certain nostalgia for how things used to be. But I do think we have moved to a more efficient and I think probably a more family-friendly sort of arrangement, albeit that our sittings are late. We sit from on a Tuesday from 2 till 10:15, on a Wednesday and Thursday, on a Wednesday from 12 until 10:15, and on a Thursday from 12 until 8:15. And we have committee sessions in the morning. We have tried to separate out the conflict that had been existing for many members. Do I go to a plenary or do I go to my committee? It is a lot. It's a long week, and people still complain that it's not family friendly.
Could I just add, Mr. Finney, you mentioned about outside individuals. When I was appointed to the House of Lords, shortly thereafter, there was a body established, the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards. It was an independent body, a joint committee of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, under the chairmanship of my successor at the Treasury Committee, Andrew Tyree, as all of it. But it was totally independent. And we had a clerk from the House with us, Colin Lee, an excellent clerk, but he was allowed to employ expertise from outside who would help the committee itself, given that there were going to be pressures on the committee, and they were very helpful, but it was under parliamentary control and parliamentary direction to that. So I think there are initiatives that you can bring people in to help your committee structure and therefore help the Parliament at the same time.
That's very helpful. That's, two small ones, if I may. Again, to Mr. O'Farrell, and I would welcome Lord McFall's views on it too. There's been mention made of pre-legislative scrutiny, and I think that's something we could learn there. Is that something that's come in with the reforms? Was it there before? And what about post-legislative scrutiny, please?
Now you're singing my song. Yes, there had been a certain element of pre-legislative scrutiny that commenced, I would say, in the aftermath of the 2011 election. But it's now, the rule now is that we will have pre-legislative scrutiny in every case except where the sectoral committee deems it to be unnecessary. There is an aspiration now for the first time ever, and this is something I don't mind saying I've driven myself, to have post-legislative scrutiny. We haven't worked out the details of that yet, but I would think that a year, 18 months after the enactment of a piece of legislation, we do desperately need to sit down and review how the implementation of that legislation is working. We have been completely remiss in the past on that front, and it's an area of weakness, and I'm personally very anxious to see it addressed sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Could I say that in the next few weeks the House of Lords will be coming out with a post-legislative scrutiny bill, and I'll share it with the committee for you, but we've done that in a few years, and I think that aspect is really important. But with the, if you like, programme orders, guillotine in the House of Commons, and family-friendly hours in a sense, what happens is that the scrutiny is less than satisfactory. For example, we were discussing this in the House of Lords a few weeks ago, and the Financial Act 2005 and Immigration Bill, we would say they weren't good examples of that. So as a result, when the Investigatory Powers Bill was being put before Parliament, it was insisted that an independent committee was set up under the chairmanship of a friend of mine, Lord Murphy, former Northern Ireland Secretary, and that took evidence at the very beginning. It went with that evidence and recommendations to the Home Secretary, Theresa May, at the time, and it included 3 reports from independent bodies. It also, after that, included pre-legislative scrutiny of a draft bill, and draft bills are rare now, and I would suggest to you that draft bills are really, really important so that you get it right. If I think back to the 1990s, I was on the Labour front bench in the 1990s, and at the time there was a bill going through, the Raves Bill. I don't know if some of you remember that there was an accident at a rave in Ayr, and some young people tragically lost their lives. So the government, and it was Michael Forsyth at the time, was putting through a bill, and my good friend James Douglas Hamilton was my opposite number at the time. So I suggested to James that, look, it's no use sitting in Westminster doing this rave bill. Why don't we visit Scotland? And we had pre-legislative sessions in Glasgow, Edinburgh, with the police, with individuals from Ayr, from others. As a result, a few months later, James stopped me in the corridor and he says, John, he said, you do remember the Raves Bill? He said, it was a 3-clause bill, yes, with the substantial clause being clause 2, James. I says, yes. He says, as a result of our visits to Scotland and our pre-leg, we've decided to withdraw clause 2, which was a major clause in the bill, and redraft it. Now, we would not have done that had we not taken that expertise in Scotland near home and near where the action occurs. So that aspect is very important. So the draft bill element is really important, and the scrutiny on the floor of the House, and I think there's a job for the Scottish Parliament to do in that yet.
Okay, thank you both very much.
Thank you very much. John?
If it's all right, I wanted to move a little bit on to engagement, unless anybody wanted to follow up on the post-legislative scrutiny thing, because I'm very conscious that most people understand the sort of dual role of a parliament. And I appreciate that all 3 that we're talking about there are slightly different. One being, if you like, the chamber of the nation, and the other being this specific scrutiny role. And when you talked, Lord McFall, about when you went upstairs, you would be doing it in effectively in secrecy. You'd be fully out of public view. I mean, it's a slightly philosophical question. If scrutiny is still being done, does it matter if the public doesn't see it? And it's really a question about what is the purpose of a parliament and what's the purpose of the engagement. Are you seeking to reach out simply to make good citizens and help them understand what the parliament is for, and therefore tick that box of citizenship? And I used to work for the European Parliament, and we thought lots of school visits and a bit of online streaming, and that was the job done. If people wanted Parliament, it was there. Or is it actually to try and elicit an active response from individuals, whether it's through public juries or other things that we've talked about, and get, if you like, life stories and individual witnesses in to Parliament in a different way rather than coming in front of formal committees? Everybody takes engagement to be an absolute essential, but it's really questioning what is the purpose, the value, if you like, and the effectiveness of it.
For my part, I think engagement is absolutely essential, more essential now as we look at what's happening around the developed world than ever before. I think in terms of what we're about, We are trying to use every method available to us, from the traditional media to social media to the establishment in 2014 of a dedicated parliamentary channel, which is now available to 99% of the population of the Republic. We're trying to ensure that we have an open Parliament, that the public access to the work that's going on there is maximised. We're encouraging input to the legislative process through the various forms of media that I've referred to. So I think it's most important at a time when public cynicism, I was speaking with your presiding officer earlier, and I'm very conscious of the fact that you are a relatively new Parliament, and that there's been a level of excitement around the whole political process in Scotland that we perhaps have not had in the Republic. In 2019, we'll celebrate 100 years of parliamentary democracy. So I'm very conscious of a very high level of public cynicism about politics, politicians, a lack of public faith in us, a lack of understanding of what we do, the residue still there of the public bitterness towards politicians arising out of the aftermath of the recession. So I think all of us in politics, in the Republic at least, have to really rebuild a level of faith and confidence and trust in the people. So therefore it is absolutely essential that what we do openly, that we listen, that we hear, and that we listen to the people with contrary views, and that the public feel that they have a genuine opportunity directly as citizens or through interest groups that they may be part of, to feed into that whole legislative process. The one thing I'd just say in conclusion, one of the strengths perhaps of the political system in the Republic is that people have a very strong sense of ownership of us. Two fellows speaking recently in a local pub in my constituency we're a multi-seat constituency. They were talking about a particular deputy, and one fellow said, well, he's a bit of a fool, and the other said, he might be, but he's our fool. So there is that sense of ownership that they have of us, and there may be some element of trust remaining with your individual deputy, but not with the body politic, and that's what we have to repair.
I think in terms of scrutiny, it's not scrutiny for its own sake here. And in fact, I wouldn't want to share with the public the many hours I've spent in committees on scrutiny in terms of a lot of boring stuff. It's the outcome that we're interested in, because at the end of the day, it's all about the integrity of the legislation about it. And the type of society we have today is one that's becoming increasingly complex and opaque with our legislation. For example, in 2010 in the UK Parliament, 2,700 pages were added to the statute book. Now that's 3 times the legislation that had been passed in the previous 50 years each year. Why these 2,700 pages? Why from 2005 to 2010 that part of all of 77 acts were passed have never been used or part used? Why are they impractical? So that quality of legislation is important if the public are going to have faith in the legislator. So that's the connection between it. And I mentioned us living in a complex and opaque society. We're living in a society, which, as I mentioned earlier, that wants ready answers for issues. And if our politicians find themselves in a very, very difficult position just now. So it's incumbent of all of us to have leadership on this. What do I mean by leadership? It's to help people face reality. That means a few uncomfortable community hall debates that you're going to have over the next few months and years, but it's also to mobilise them to make that change and to understand where the challenges are coming for us. I mean, even in the last 7 or 8 years, what have we had? We've had the establishment of Uber, which is the world's largest taxi company, but it owns no vehicles. We've had the establishment of Facebook, which is the world's most popular media owner, which creates no content. And we've had the Airbnb, which is the world's largest accommodation provider that owns no property. So the world is changing dramatically for us under our feet. And given the advances in artificial intelligence, and there's a report, as I read, coming through in the train today in the Times, which talks about 30–40% of civil service jobs, health, education, whatever, being done by robotics in the future. So we don't have time, and we don't have time to even have the same language we had years ago. And there's many people wanting to have our jobs, particularly from emerging countries, and to be able to do it. And the technology is there to do it. And I think the issue facing politicians, amongst others, is that technological advance has increased at a faster rate than social advance. So in other words, there's that gap for all of us. And politicians just don't know the answer to that, unlike other people who don't know the answer. So that aspect of facing up to reality is really important, to be straight with people and to be saying, look, there ain't any simple answers to complex problems, but we're there with you and we'll work alongside you.
Just following up exactly on that point, I mean, we're at least in the United Kingdom, we're expecting fairly substantial changes in where power lies in the next 2–3 years, whatever it might be. And give that on top of everything else that will change in the workplace, socially, whatever. It seems to me that at any moment in time, reforming Parliament to keep up with those is difficult. So how do you future-proof in this respect? Do you have a constant rolling process of scrutiny? Are you comfortable that you can, in both cases, sort of tack where necessary to meet these new challenges? Or in the case of a Parliament like this, which may inherit quite substantial new powers in a couple of years, depending on what happens with Brexit, how do you cope with that kind of forward-looking process?
Difficult. Sorry, why don't you go, Sean?
No, I think you do so organically. You followed the changes that are happening in the society and in the body politic around you, and we've all of us got to commit to constant change for the better, where possible, and that's the real challenge for us, isn't it? To be able to adjudicate on the initiatives that we need to take in order to do what we do better, and not simply respond to those who shout loudest, but to have a qualitative aspect to everything we do.
I think it's very hard, very difficult. And MD says they can give you an answer to that. It's crazy. I've been in politics 30 years and I ain't going to give you an answer because I don't know. Right? So, but let me say to you, what we need is a lively, flexible and outreaching Parliament. And I think that aspect is really important. Let me talk to you about flexible element. When I was in the House of Commons, I was very, very keen at getting the Consumer Credit Act updated. And I pushed government on it because the Consumer Credit Act was dated from 1974, if I remember, the Consumer Credit Act 1974. And in 2002 or 3, I was saying to the government, look, you better update this. Why? Because we now have the internet. We've now got a digital economy. And the Consumer Credit Act is based in 1974. Now, it took the mother of all battles to get that in the Queen's speech, because you've got to battle away for a year or so before to get it on the Cabinet, to get it debated, to get it in for the Queen's speech, because there's just a set amount of bills every year. But we did get that in it, and we got the 2006 Consumer Credit Act. That is still on the statute book. So it's already out of date. Because I mentioned about Facebook, Uber and whatever else, that's since 2007 is all. So this is out of date already. So I had a monumental challenge in pushing it for 2006, but all the efforts have come to naught in a sense because it's really outdated. So Parliament has really got to keep up that pace. So that reinterpretation of the agenda that I said to you, that flexibility, that is really, really important. And it needs a new mindset for all of us.
You said a lively and outreaching Parliament, and one of our responsibilities is to discuss engagement with the people of Scotland, the whole country. Large country, many people living in rural areas, many far away from the privileged central belt. And in line with that, we've also been discussing and taking evidence from a number of people about participative democracy, and we're having some advice from academics about what goes on in different countries in terms of how people can participate in the in the legislative process through the internet and through digital means. And we've had some interesting discussions around our own table about the balance between participative democracy and representative democracy. You elect a member of Parliament to work, do the job, get on with it, represent the constituents, and then the participative part of it. And the participative part is very difficult and complex. As senior parliamentarians, I mean, do you think the idea of more participation, more engagement is overdone, and that people would, I mean, it's more an opinion rather than that, or are people just happy to let their members get on with it, or do they want to see their Parliament out there dealing with it and they're taking a more active role in what the Parliament does?
I think perhaps the latter. They want to see the Parliament getting on with it. They want to know that they can exert influence if necessary. One of the things, for example, in terms of outreach, we've had an educational programme running in the Oireachtas over a number of years, whereby people went out to schools and engaged directly with them. Our members are encouraged through that programme to visit schools and talk to students. We have an education programme on the internet, which allows us to connect and deliver part of the educational programme for second-level students. As well as that, some of our sectoral committees have toured the country and convened hearings in different locations in order to give a level of access. Interestingly, just in conclusion on this, I would say that at local government level, I have seen a situation develop whereby local government in Ireland certainly feels threatened and may well perhaps been somewhat diminished by the increased role that has been given to a whole range of voluntary NGOs and voluntary sector bodies, to the point that many local government members would tell you now that when it comes to activity in their particular county areas, that they would have to go very often to the local voluntary body to find out what's happening, or where the money has been spent, or what particular initiatives are envisaged, and that they'd get the information there much more readily than they would directly themselves from the local authority. And you know, at the end of the day, there is a value in being elected, and we shouldn't be setting about diminishing the importance of elected office.
I know the Scottish Parliament has undertaken quite a number of innovative experiments in social media and elsewhere, and I think that aspect is important. But I think it comes down to Edward Burke's dictum, whether the politician is a delegate or a representative. And I think I tend towards the representative end of that, because the politician has to take the difficult decisions at the end of the day, but there has to be maximum engagement with it. But my own experience before I gave up, I remember when the J&B bottling plant closed in my constituency in 1998, and we lost about 450 jobs, and it was quite a blow for the area. But I set up a task force and engaged with the trade unions and with the management. As a result of that, we had a body called Lomongate that has come into being. Now, 16 years later, it has delivered more than 500 million gross value added to the place. It has going to be employing by 2019, according to economic consultants, about 1,900 employees. So we've far outweighed what we had before. But it was a long, a difficult and a painful project. And I think I remember, if I could give a very down-to-earth comment, some of the employees of J&B would be in the pub, and there were with a few friends of mine. And they said, well, if McFall came through this door, he wouldn't get out the pub alive, you know, because J&B has closed. Fast forward 3 or 4 years, and if McFall came through this door and he took away our pensions, which we've gained now as a result of that, he wouldn't get out the pub alive. So there was an intervening period where things were difficult as a result of that. And so therefore, in a sense, what is demanded of the politician is leadership. And it has to be quite tough at times. But that representative element with the politician cannot be taken away. So, because at the end of the day, the politicians are responsible. Yes, engage as much as we can, but there has to be mature judgments that are taken with a long-term and societal interest.
Thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time. I wonder if you'd allow me a couple of just specific questions on a couple of narrow issues. We've had a fair bit around this table, and I've been reading in and learning about the innovations of the House of Lords as a chamber, and how this self-regulatory chamber has introduced a number of important innovations in recent years. How important is it that there are a number of crossbenchers in there? Could you describe the influence of crossbenchers as distinct from people who are sitting on one of the political party benches in terms of the chamber and how it operates?
Yeah, well, the crossbenchers, I think there's about 143 crossbenchers in total, and there is a convener of crossbenchers, in fact, the Lord Hope, whom you'll know, Lord Hope. Given that I'm chairman of the committees, I meet with Lord Hope and others on a regular basis, say every 2 or 3 weeks, to ensure that the domestic committees and the procedure and the business of the House takes place. The crossbenchers comprise 92 members of the hereditary, because in 1999 the hereditary peers went, but 92 were left in the compromise agreement which is made. In addition to that, there are about 10 every year who are appointed by the Prime Minister and others for their contribution to public estate, for example, former Cabinet Secretaries and others as a result of that. And there is a House of Lords Appointments Committee for members of the public that are going to be nominated, and that goes before that House of Lords Commission. In fact, there's a television programme coming up very soon, and one of the crossbenchers was John Bird, who was who established the social innovation. Tell me what the name of the paper is. Yeah, that's the big issue, sorry. So John Bird has come in, but he came in through that process. So crossbenchers, they've got a range of views on it, but they add to the House in the sense that, let's say, if there is an amendment being put forward, it is most likely to have the best chance of success if there's a head of crossbench support behind it, because the number of appointees by the Conservatives and Labour is about the same. There's quite a few more Liberal Democrats which in as well, but it's the crossbenchers, I think, that have got influence in that. So they're like the other groups, the Conservatives, the Labour, they take their part in it, but they're, if you like, completely non-political, but they're an integral part of the House, and therefore they're part of what they would call the usual channels. So that's why I meet with crossbenchers. In fact, I went just about a month ago to address their group, so that if they have any issues, are there any problems, they can be brought up with us. And in fact, one of the complaints I got at the time was that, look, we come to the House of Lords every day, there's not enough committee vacancies for us. How can you, as chairman of the committees, i.e. me, get more of us on committees as a result? So, like yourself, Mr McCormick, I got my problems.
Thank you very much. We were talking earlier on, Lord McFall was talking about the importance of legislative scrutiny, and he referred to the pre-legislative bills being scrutinised. Do you have that similar process, Nadoyle, of where bills in draft form would be taken out, the example of the rave bill in Ayr and how it was improved by the public intervention, as it were, and consultation? Do you have a lot of pre-legislative scrutiny, or occasionally?
Yes, since the reform package has been introduced, there's a dramatic increase in the amount of pre-legislative scrutiny that's taking place. But what's actually happening with us is reflective of the change that I've referred to on a number of occasions now in the Dáil, in Parliament. We've had a slowdown in output of legislation by government for a variety of reasons, but mostly because government must build consensus around whatever their particular initiatives are going to be. We have had a massive increase in the amount of legislation being produced by opposition. But the quality of some of the opposition work is, albeit that it may be able to progress, and will in fact progress, to the statute books, it will need to be developed and refined to a far greater extent than it is currently at. So our current dilemma that we're working with our business committee on is to try and provide additional resources to opposition and backbench government deputies to improve the quality of the legislation that they're producing, and to ensure that the sectoral committees devote more of their time to scrutinising this legislation, both government and opposition legislation, and processing it through to a point where it can return to the House for a plenary session at report stage to be finalised.
Thank you.
Could I just sum up my points, Mr. McCormick, very quickly? I think, first of all, that the presiding officer has got to be numero uno, and that will allow the flexibility to reinterpret the parameters within which you work, and I think that can be done. Secondly, the Scottish Parliament and the government, they've got to be distinctive in the public's eye, and I think efforts have to be made to ensure that. Thirdly, I think there should be a review of the time that the Parliament spends, how it spends its time, and how it holds those in power to be accountable. And fourthly, I mentioned about leadership. Because of the challenges we all face in the global moving society, that help people face reality and mobilise them to make change. And one thing I would suggest here in terms of best practice would be, say, an annual meeting of parliamentarians. We have ministerial meetings, but we don't have parliamentarians meeting. So UK, Westminster, Northern Ireland, Welsh, Scottish parliamentarians meeting, so that we can pursue that agenda of flexibility and ensure that we keep up to date and get the best practice. Then the integrity of legislation is very important. And if there's anything I could say to you, put an explanatory note of the time spent on scrutiny. That will embarrass some people, and it'll maybe make them think, wait a minute, we can't let this bill go through without a 30-second intervention or without us spending 3 hours on the whole bill. That's why we've got the complexity. That's why we've got the superfluous legislation. And then we have strong committees to have the solidarity and to ensure that they pursue the country's interests, and that message to get across, that they pursue the country's interests. And lastly, I would say a cultural ethos that where the Parliament is seen as first and the party representatives come after that primary duty. And that, I think, Mr McCormick, would allow the Parliament to breathe as a bigger entity.
Thank you very much. I see you nodding there, Mr. O'Farrell. Could I interpret that you're in agreement with that broad approach? Yes. Well, we've gone into injury time, as I call it. We're very, very grateful to you. Thank you for being here and for spending so long with us. And it's been very, very valuable to us. And I trust that if we, in the weeks ahead, as we're forming our emerging conclusions, if we do wish to contact you on a more point of clarification or something like that, that would be acceptable to you. But for the moment, as we draw this public session to a close, just to express my gratitude of the whole Commission to you for your time and your advice. Thank you very much.